My husband stood up at our 10th anniversary party, champagne glass raised, and said the words that would destroy our marriage. To my wife, Penelope, proof that you can polish trash, but it's still trash. The room went silent. But what I announced next made him wish he'd never been born. My husband stood up at our 10th anniversary party, champagne glass raised, and said the words that would destroy our marriage. To my wife, Penelope, proof that you can polish trash, but it's still trash. The room went silent. But what I announced next made him wish he'd never been born. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and if you've ever been publicly humiliated by someone you trusted, hit that subscribe button because this story is about to show you exactly how karma works when you're patient enough to let it. My name is Penelope, and 6 months ago, I thought I had the perfect life. I was married to Richard Blackwell. Yes, those Blackwells, the family that owns half the commercial real estate in Manhattan. We lived in a penthouse that cost more than most people make in a lifetime. I drove a Bentley and wore jewelry that required insurance policies. But here's what nobody knew. I came from nothing. Absolutely nothing. Mini cliffhanger. The truth about my past would eventually become the weapon Richard used to destroy me. I grew up in a trailer park in Alabama, raised by my grandmother after my parents died in a car crash when I was 8. We survived on food stamps and thrift store clothes. I worked 3 jobs through high school, slept on a mattress on the floor, and dreamed of a different life every single night. But I was smart. Scary smart. I earned a full scholarship to Columbia, studied finance and economics, and graduated summa cum laude. That's where I met Richard during my senior year. He was getting his MBA, driving a Ferrari his daddy bought him, and I was tutoring spoiled rich kids to pay for groceries. The first time Richard saw me, I was wearing a secondhand designer dress I'd found at Goodwill, my hair done in a style I'd copied from a magazine. He thought I was old money trying to be modest. Mini cliffhanger. I should have corrected him. But his assumption would change both our lives forever. You have this elegance about you, he said that first night over champagne I couldn't afford. Like you were born to this lifestyle. I smiled and didn't correct him. Why would I? For the first time in my life, someone was looking at me like I belonged in their world. Our relationship moved fast. Richard was charming, generous, and completely smitten with the version of me he'd created in his head, the mysterious heiress who just happened to be brilliant with numbers. His parents, Harrison and Victoria Blackwell, welcomed me with the kind of warmth reserved for people they assume share their tax bracket. She's perfect for you, darling, Victoria told Richard at our engagement party, her diamond tennis bracelet catching the light as she gestured. So refined, so appropriate. I never explicitly lied about my background, but I never corrected their assumptions either. When they asked about my family, I'd say my grandmother raised me after my parents died. Technically true. When they wondered about my education, I mentioned Columbia. Also true. I just left out the trailer park, the food stamps, and the 3 jobs. Mini cliffhanger. Our wedding was like a fairy tale. But fairy tales don't prepare you for what happens when the magic wears off. Our wedding was featured in Town and Country magazine. 500 guests, a ceremony at St. Patrick's Cathedral, reception at the Plaza. I wore a custom Vera Wang gown that cost more than my grandmother's entire trailer, and for one perfect day, I felt like I truly belonged in this glittering world. The early years of our marriage were blissful. Richard was proud to show off his beautiful, intelligent wife. I used my financial expertise to help grow the family business, implementing strategies that increased their portfolio value by 30% in 2 years. I was the perfect Blackwell wife, elegant, sophisticated, and quietly powerful. But success has a way of making people careless. Mini cliffhanger. The mistake I made 3 years ago would eventually give Richard the ammunition to destroy me. 3 years into our marriage, during a family dinner, Richard's cousin Marcus made an offhand comment about new money trying to buy class. Richard laughed and said, "At least Penelope comes from real breeding. Not like those lottery winners trying to crash our parties." I should have stayed quiet. But the wine had loosened my tongue, and something about his smug certainty irritated me. Actually, I said with a small smile, my grandmother always said class isn't about your bank account. It's about how you treat people who can't do anything for you. Victoria raised an eyebrow. How wonderfully philosophical. Your grandmother sounds like quite the character. What was her family name again? Johnson. I replied without thinking. The conversation moved on, but I caught Victoria exchanging a glance with Harrison that made my stomach clench. Mini cliffhanger. I didn't know it then, but that moment planted a seed of suspicion that would grow into something dangerous. For months, everything seemed normal. Richard and I traveled to Paris, bought a summer house in the Hamptons, hosted dinner parties where I played the perfect hostess in designer gowns. But I started noticing small changes. Victoria's smiles seemed more calculated. Harrison asked oddly specific questions about my childhood. Richard began making subtle comments about breeding and bloodlines that felt pointed. Then came the night that changed everything. Richard had been drinking expensive scotch, the kind his father reserved for closing million-dollar deals. We were in our marble-floored living room, city lights glittering through floor-to-ceiling windows, when he turned to me with an expression I'd never seen before. I hired someone to look into your background, Penelope. My blood turned to ice. Mini cliffhanger. What he said next would shatter the life I'd built on a foundation of half-truths. Imagine my surprise, Richard continued, swirling his scotch, to discover that my wife, the woman I introduced to society as refined breeding, grew up in a goddamn trailer park. The words hung in the air like poison. Richard, I never lied to you. You let me believe you were one of us, he exploded, his face flushing red. Do you know how humiliating this is? My father's already heard rumors. People are starting to whisper about the Blackwell heir who married trailer trash. Don't call me that, I said quietly, my voice steady despite the rage building in my chest. What else should I call you? You're a fraud, Penelope. A beautiful, brilliant fraud, but still a fraud. Mini cliffhanger. But Richard wasn't done destroying me. His next move would be even more calculated. The emotional abuse started subtly. Richard would make comments about my background during arguments, remind me how lucky I was that he'd rescued me from poverty, suggest that I should be grateful for the lifestyle he provided. Without me, he said during one particularly vicious fight, you'd still be in Alabama, probably pregnant by some mechanic. He started undermining me in social situations, making jokes about my wife's humble beginnings that made people uncomfortable. He'd embarrass me in front of his family, friends, business associates, always with a smile, always under the guise of teasing, but the intent was clear. He wanted me to know my place. Mini cliffhanger. But while Richard was busy humiliating me, I was busy planning something he never saw coming. See, Richard made one crucial mistake. He assumed that because I came from nothing, I was nothing. He forgot that I'd graduated summa cum laude from Columbia. He forgot that I'd increased his family's wealth by millions. He forgot that I was the one who'd been managing our personal investments for years. While he was playing psychological warfare, I was playing chess. I started quietly documenting everything. The verbal abuse, the public humiliation, the financial control he'd begun exerting. I recorded conversations, saved emails, kept a detailed journal. But more importantly, I started moving money. Mini cliffhanger. The investment account Richard didn't know about was about to become my freedom fund. 3 years earlier, I'd opened an investment account using money from my Columbia tutoring business, money that was legally mine from before our marriage. I'd been growing it slowly, carefully, using my financial expertise to turn that modest nest egg into something substantial. Richard had no idea it existed. I also started reaching out to my old contacts from Columbia, quietly rebuilding the professional network I'd abandoned when I became a Blackwell wife. I began freelance consulting for investment firms, using a pseudonym and working from coffee shops while Richard thought I was having lunch with the other society wives. Mini cliffhanger. But I needed one more piece of evidence to destroy Richard completely. And he was about to give it to me. Our 10th anniversary was approaching, and Victoria insisted on throwing us a party. After all, darling, she said with that razor-sharp smile, 10 years deserves a proper celebration. The guest list read like a who's who of Manhattan society: politicians, business moguls, socialites, media personalities. The Blackwells spared no expense, transforming their Park Avenue penthouse into something out of a magazine. I wore a stunning emerald green gown by Oscar de la Renta, my hair swept up in an elegant chignon, diamonds glittering at my throat. I looked every inch the successful society wife, and I knew it would be the last time. Mini cliffhanger. During the party, I overheard a conversation that confirmed what I'd suspected all along. An hour into the party, I excused myself to use the powder room and overheard Richard talking to his father in the study. The prenup was ironclad, Harrison was saying. She gets nothing if she leaves voluntarily and minimal support if we divorce her for cause. I just need a few more months, Richard replied. I'm documenting her instabilities. The way she gets emotional about her past, the drinking. I'm not drinking more than usual, I thought, confused. And once I have enough evidence of mental instability, we can have the marriage annulled. Claim she misrepresented herself from the beginning. My blood ran cold. They weren't just planning to humiliate me. They were planning to destroy me legally and financially. Mini cliffhanger. But they had no idea I'd been recording everything. And I was about to turn their own party into their nightmare. I returned to the party with a smile plastered on my face, my phone discreetly recording in my clutch. I made small talk, laughed at appropriate moments, and played the perfect hostess while my husband and his family plotted my destruction. Then came the moment I'd been waiting for. Richard stood up, champagne glass in hand, calling for everyone's attention. The room fell silent, politicians, CEOs, socialites all turning expectant faces toward my husband. Ladies and gentlemen, Richard began, his voice carrying that particular tone of condescension I'd grown to hate. 10 years ago, I married a woman I thought was perfect for our family. Murmurs of appreciation rippled through the crowd. But over the years, I've learned that you can take someone out of the trailer park. He paused for effect, his eyes finding mine across the room. But you can't take the trailer park out of them. Mini cliffhanger. The room went deadly silent. But I was ready with an announcement that would destroy him. Gasps echoed through the room. Victoria's face went white. Harrison's jaw dropped. I saw several guests pull out their phones, probably already composing texts about the social disaster they were witnessing. Richard raised his glass higher, his smile cruel and triumphant. To my wife Penelope, proof that you can polish trash, but it's still trash. The silence was deafening. I could feel every eye in the room on me, waiting to see if I'd cry, if I'd run, if I'd collapse under the weight of such public humiliation. Instead, I smiled. I walked gracefully to the front of the room, my heels clicking against the marble floor, and gently took the microphone from the stunned band leader. Mini cliffhanger. What I announced next would not only destroy Richard, but shock everyone in that room. Thank you, Richard, I said, my voice clear and confident. That was illuminating. I turned to address the room full of Manhattan's elite, my smile growing wider. Since my husband has chosen to air our private business so publicly, I suppose it's only fair that I share some news of my own. Richard's face was starting to show concern. First, I'd like to announce that as of Monday morning, I'll be the new senior portfolio manager at Goldman Sachs, a position I earned through my track record of increasing investment returns by an average of 40% over the past 3 years. Murmurs of surprise rippled through the crowd. Richard's face went pale. Mini cliffhanger. But I wasn't done. The best part was yet to come. Second, I'd like to thank my husband for reminding everyone about my humble beginnings. Because you're absolutely right, Richard. I did come from nothing. And from nothing, I built myself into someone worthy of Columbia University, worthy of managing millions in investments, and worthy of respect. The room was completely silent now. But most importantly, I continued, pulling out my phone. I'd like to share this recording I made an hour ago. Richard's face went from pale to gray as my voice played through the sound system, crystal clear. The prenup was ironclad. She gets nothing if she leaves voluntarily. I'm documenting her instabilities. Once I have enough evidence of mental instability, we can have the marriage annulled. The twist that changed everything. The room exploded into shocked whispers. But I held up my hand for silence. Oh, but there's more. Richard, darling, remember that investment account you thought didn't exist? The one I've been building for 3 years. His eyes widened in horror. Well, it turns out that when you're really good with money, trailer park education and all, you can turn $50,000 into $12 million in 3 years. And since it was my money from before our marriage, well, it's still my money. The silence was so complete you could hear the traffic from the street below. And Richard, that prenup you're so confident about? The one that says I get nothing if I leave voluntarily? Well, it has a very interesting clause about spousal abuse, including emotional and psychological abuse. And I have 3 years of documentation. Mini cliffhanger, but the final twist would destroy the Blackwell family completely. But here's my favorite part, I said, my voice carrying to every corner of the room. 6 months ago, Richard asked me to handle some discreet investments for the family business. Investments that, it turns out, violate several SEC regulations. Harrison stepped forward, his face ashen. Penelope, you can't. Oh, but I can, I smiled sweetly. And I already have. The SEC received a very detailed report this morning, along with all supporting documentation. Apparently, whistleblowers in financial fraud cases receive quite substantial rewards. Richard dropped his champagne glass, the crystal shattering against the marble floor like our marriage. The ending that destroyed everything. So here's what's going to happen. I announced to the room full of New York's most powerful people. I'm filing for divorce on Monday morning, citing emotional abuse, financial manipulation, and irreconcilable differences. The SEC investigation should conclude within 6 months, and I estimate the Blackwell family will lose approximately 60% of their assets in fines and legal fees. I paused, letting that sink in. Oh, and Richard? That job at Goldman Sachs? They specifically headhunted me after seeing my work exposing financial fraud. Turns out, trailer park girls who work their way up are exactly the kind of people they want on their team. I set the microphone down gently and walked toward the door, every eye in the room following me. The prenup might say I get nothing if I leave voluntarily. I called over my shoulder, but it says I get 50% of everything if I leave due to spousal abuse. See you in court, darling. 6 months later, I was sitting in my new corner office at Goldman Sachs, overlooking Central Park, when my assistant knocked on the door. Miss Johnson, she said with a smile, there's a Richard Blackwell here to see you. He doesn't have an appointment. I looked up from the financial reports I was reviewing, reports that would help my new client recover the millions they'd lost in a Ponzi scheme. Tell Mr. Blackwell that Miss Johnson is busy, I said with a smile. But if he'd like to make an appointment through proper channels, I might have 15 minutes available next month. Through my office windows, I could see Richard standing in the lobby, his expensive suit wrinkled, his confident swagger replaced by the desperate posture of a man who'd lost everything. The SEC investigation had concluded exactly as I'd predicted. The Blackwell family lost their business, their properties, and their reputation. Richard was working as a junior associate at a small firm, trying to rebuild a career destroyed by his own arrogance. The final twist. But here's the twist nobody saw coming. I never actually reported the Blackwells to the SEC. The violations I mentioned at the party were completely fabricated, impressive-sounding financial jargon that meant absolutely nothing. But Richard's panic, his father's reaction, and the room full of witnesses hearing them essentially confess to crimes they didn't commit? That created enough suspicion to trigger a real SEC investigation. And once investigators started digging into the Blackwell finances, they found actual violations: tax evasion, money laundering, fraudulent reporting, crimes I'd suspected but never had proof of. Richard destroyed himself trying to hide from crimes that didn't exist, only to have real crimes discovered in the process. Closing message. I kept my grandmother's last name, Johnson. The trailer park girl who was supposedly trash now manages portfolios worth billions and has been featured on the cover of Forbes magazine. As for Richard, last I heard, he was engaged to a socialite whose daddy's money might help rebuild the Blackwell reputation. She has no idea that her fiancé once called his wife trailer trash in front of Manhattan's elite. But I do. And so do 300 witnesses who were at that party. Sometimes the best revenge isn't getting mad, it's getting smart, getting even, and getting everything you deserve. Class isn't about where you come from. It's about where you're going and who you choose to be when you get there. Tell me in the comments, have you ever been underestimated because of your background? Have you ever had someone try to make you feel small for where you came from? Share your story below. And if this tale of turning humiliation into triumph inspired you, smash that like and subscribe button for more stories about people who refuse to stay down. Remember, they can call you trash, but diamonds are just coal that handled pressure better than anyone expected.